I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Martin James, from the Air Force historian. And Martin will speak tonight about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Very important given Anzac Day yesterday. The 28th of March was the 80th anniversary of the battle. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Martin James, and perhaps keep your questions until the close of his talk tonight. Martin, without further ado, we welcome you to our evening here, and I say to you, handing over.
Okay, thanks very much. Excellent. Okay, look, thanks everyone for the very warm welcome and invitation to present this evening. On 3rd of March this year, we marked the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Just over 3/4 of a century ago, elements of the RAAF, United States Army Air Force, intercepted a Japanese convoy consisting of 8 freighters and 8 escort destroyers. These vessels were transiting the Bismarck Sea from the Japanese-held harbour of Rabaul in New Britain to Lae, northeast coast of New Guinea. On board the convoy was 6,900 enemy troops of the 51st Infantry Division, 2/3 of the 14th Artillery Regiment, 2/3 of the 51st Engineer Regiment, the 3rd Naval Air Defence Unit, and a Naval Special Landing Force. Additionally, the ships also carried aviation and motor transport fuel, artillery, anti-aircraft guns, motor transport vehicles, and in excess of 3,500 cubic metres of ammunition and food stocks. In all, an estimated 4 months supply for 20,000 troops. Also on board were landing barges and small supply vessels. This point will become pertinent a bit later. Air attacks or Allied air attacks from the 2nd to the 5th of March resulted in the loss of all 8 freighters and 4 of the escort destroyers. Japanese casualties were put at just over 3,600 troops killed, and just as importantly, the urgently needed munitions and supplies were all lost at sea. Only 800 troops reached their intended destinations on the battlefields around Lae, with the remaining survivors all being returned to Rabaul. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was an emphatic victory, or tactical victory for the Allies. For the loss of just 4 aircraft and 13 aircrew, the Allies won a decisive victory, which had significant consequences in the following months. Quite apart from the material losses it inflicted on the adversary, in preventing reinforcements from reaching New Guinea, the Allied ground assaults on Mubu, Salamaua, and Lae later in the year were opposed by greatly reduced garrisons as a result. As it was, Australian losses in the ground fighting in this area from April to September was just over 1,000 casualties, which included 343 killed in action. The impact then of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in preventing an additional 6,000 well-supplied and fresh Japanese troops from reaching the battle space can only be guessed at. Ever since the results of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea were publicly announced to a war-weary nation, the action has resonated within Australia. In marking this year's anniversary, I would like to consider the significance of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea beyond the tactical and statistical level, to place the action in the context of the Southwest Pacific campaign as a whole, and to consider some of the more significant elements in terms of the Australian experience of air power. By March 1943, the myth of Japanese invincibility, which had developed after their truly stunning victories from December 41 to March 42, had been well and truly shattered. Allied victories in major fleet engagements and ground campaigns had begun to disrupt Japanese plans for further expansion into the Pacific and to weaken the limited forces available for offensive operations. By March 1943, the pressure of sustained losses of ships, aircraft, trained aircrew, and ground troops, combined with successive Allied victories, was forcing the Japanese senior leadership to reconsider their operational plans and strategic posture. First, the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 42 limited the Japanese offensive operations to occupy the Solomon Islands and totally prevented their amphibious attack on Port Moresby. In this engagement, the opposing fleets never came within cannon range. Instead, it was a battle fought through new and emerging technologies which were changing the nature of battle. First, the US fleet was informed of Japanese intentions through signals intelligence enabled by advanced decryption capabilities. Second, the advent of large fleet carriers in the respective navies resulted in a series of air attacks on the opposing vessels instead of the battleship duels which characterized the major fleet actions of World War I. As demonstrated by the attack on Pearl Harbor and the loss of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, the age of the battleship was over. The age of air power, projected and enhanced through aircraft carriers, was now the ultimate form of sea power. While the losses of the two fleets in the Battle of the Coral Sea were similar in that they both lost to the aircraft carrier and some 160 aircraft in total, the industrial capacity and the population base of the US meant that the attrition losses in ships and aircraft and train crews could be more readily replaced. The disparity in the respective nations' war potential was even more sharply highlighted just 1 month later in June 1942, at the Battle of Midway. Another engagement in which signals intelligence and air power played key roles in the final outcome. The planned Japanese offensive, targeting the small Pacific atoll of Midway, was intended to lure the US fleet into an engagement which would render such losses on the US forces that a negotiated settlement favourable to Japan might be possible, or at least secure the outer edge of the Japanese area of control. So, as in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the US forces were well informed of the enemy planes and were able to inflict grievous losses on the Japanese fleet. 4 aircraft carriers, 250 aircraft were lost, along with the irreplaceable experience of the ship and aircraft crews. Closer to home, US landings at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands and the Australian victory at the Battle of Milne Bay in the second half of 1942 thwarted further Japanese offensive operations. Similarly, the Australian success on the Kokoda Track campaign resulted in determined Japanese overland attack on Port Moresby being repulsed. Collectively then, Allied land operations were forcing Japanese onto an increasingly defensive posture and forced withdrawal in both the Solomons and New Guinea. By January 1943, Japanese forces which had attacked along the Kokoda Track had been forced back to the northeast coast of Gona and Buna and were further withdrawn along the coast of Salmarawa, Wau and Leh region to a largely defensive position. During this period, the RAAF, a force which had been neglected through the 1930s, had been progressively built up into an increasingly agile, self-sufficient expeditionary force. By March 1943, the RAAF had deployed No. 9 Group to New Guinea with a total of 7 flying squadrons consisting of a mix of reconnaissance, strike, fighter, and forward air control aircraft. No. 9 Group was further enhanced with operational base units, airfield construction units, control and reporting units, including radar stations, a sizable fleet of supply and support vessels, as well as maintenance and torpedo units. We could also call on numbers 11 and 20 Squadron to provide theatre-wide ISR aircraft in the form of Catalina flying boats. Perhaps less evident to the RAAF contribution to the Southwest Pacific campaign was the command and control elements embedded with MacArthur's headquarters. Air Vice Marshal Bill Bostock was appointed the Air Officer Commanding RAAF Command and the RAAF's Senior Operational Commander in the Southwest Pacific area. Bostock came under the strategic command of the Air Board and the operational command of General George Kenny, MacArthur's Air Component Commander. Bostock had a planning and a command element, as well as group and wing headquarters supporting his overall leadership. In particular, Bostock was blessed with one of the RAAF's most promising and experienced group captains, Bull Garing. Garing had joined the Air Force in 1927 as a pilot, and in an era when there was no specialist navigator category, had also honed his skills and was recognised as the RAAF's most experienced navigator. When war broke out in Europe, Garing was in the UK with No. 10 Squadron, where he flew Sunderland aircraft with the RAF's Coastal Command. It was while he was in the UK that Garing was to gain experience with the Navy and RAF's combined headquarters, which managed Coastal Command's operations around the UK, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. When he returned to Australia in 1941, Garing used his experience in the command and control of active operations while with the RAF to establish a series of operations rooms across Australia's north and eventually in New Guinea. Garing was to command the RAF forces at the Battle of Milne Bay, where he merged his headquarters with that of the Land Commander, Major General Clowes, to form a joint headquarters to more effectively manage air-land battle. Garing's vast experience and air-minded aptitude was to prove a decisive factor in the Allied operations and their preparations for the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The genesis for the Allied plans for the Battle of the Bismarck Sea can be found in a failed attempt to destroy an earlier smaller convoy of enemy ships when the Japanese attempted their first large-scale reinforcement of their ground forces in and around Lae. Over a period of 5 to 8 January 1943, a convoy of 5 freighters and 5 destroyers made their way from Rabaul to Lae. On board were the main elements of the Akabe detachment, composed of a reinforced infantry regiment of the 51st Division, a field artillery company, and an anti-aircraft unit. Despite being sighted by B-17 en route and subjected to repeated air attacks, only one vessel from this convoy was sunk. However, even as the convoy anchored in Lae Harbour, it was still subjected to American bombing attacks. While considered ineffectual at the time, these attacks did in fact force the Japanese to evacuate their ships before the unloading was completed. So while the troops were put ashore, they were unable to launch, so while the troops were put ashore, they were able to launch a series of determined attacks on Australian positions around Wau. Most of their equipment and stores had been returned to Rabaul. This is important, as it shows that the fighting qualities of formed Japanese units were considerable. Even when denuded of their heavy equipment and without significant logistic support, they were more than capable of inflicting considerable casualties on Allied forces, both in attack and in defence. As I mentioned earlier, some 343 RAAF soldiers were killed in action by the Japanese troops that had been deployed into the region. No Japanese force, regardless of their logistics position, could be considered ineffective. When in February, the Allies received information through signals intelligence and reconnaissance flight that another even larger convoy was being assembled at Rabaul, it was determined that it would most likely be destined for Laos. There was an immediate decision to ensure that the convoy was completely destroyed. Enter Bull Garing. Garing convinced the American air commanders, Generals Kenny and Whitehead, that the previous tactics of consecutive high-level attacks on the January convoy were inefficient and did not place the anti-aircraft defences or the escorting fighter force under sufficient pressure. What Garing proposed was a large, near-simultaneous attack conducted from high, medium, and low altitude. Furthermore, Garing stressed that the attacking units were to rehearse the timing and the delivery of the attack with live munitions. Now, we need to be careful in how much credit we give Garing for the planning and execution of the Allied air attack. Kenny notes in his post-war report that there had been considerable work within the USAF operations staff on post-operations analysis and force posture, all of which Kenny had been briefing to MacArthur and his subordinate air commanders. Garing's view on how best to tackle the convoy was to a fair degree in line with the tactics Kenny had now been directing to be considered for all future attacks. So Garing was in the fortunate position to be able to capitalise on both his experience and that tactical evolution that was occurring in theatre at the time. With the plan approved, RAAF and USAF aircraft spent the days following the decision attacking a shipwreck near Port Moresby. Progressively, the timings, attack profiles, and the accuracy of high-level bombing, low-level skip bombing, and strafing were improved. By the time the Japanese convoy left Rabaul on the night of the 28th of February, the Allies were ready and primed. One great unknown, though, was the exact route to be taken by the convoy. A comprehensive ISR plan was devised to cover both the southern and northern routes around New Britain to ensure timely interception. This was important. Many of the Allied aircraft operating out of Port Moresby would be at the extreme end of their combat range. With little margin of error, it was important that accurate target information was obtained before the aircraft took off from their airfields. On one March, a patrolling B-17 of the USAF spotted the convoy on the northern route near Cape Gloucester and immediately reported its position. It was again spotted by an RAAF aircraft of number 11 Squadron. At this point, just as the convoy's fate seemed doomed, bad weather made surveillance of the convoy extremely difficult. and was giving every indication of preventing any effective air attacks. However, while there was a delay in attacking the convoy, the Allied plan to attack the Japanese airfields within the region in order to disrupt their fighter cover over the convoy was unaffected and at times extremely effective. For example, Flight Lieutenant Bill Newton of 22 Squadron, who was to be awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions later in March, was part of the airfield attacks. On the 2nd of March, Newton made 2 bombing and forced strafing attacks on the Lae airfield in the face of accurate and heavy anti-aircraft fire, destroying several aircraft on the ground. The Japanese plan called for up to 100 fighters to be airborne over the convoy during daylight hours. As a result of the weather and the airfield attacks, this number rarely got over 26 aircraft. A break in the weather on the 2nd of March did allow for 2 attacks on the convoy, which inflicted slight damage to a number of vessels and at least 1 direct hit on the Kususi Maru, which was sufficient to sink it. 2 of the escort destroyers were able to rescue nearly 800 troops from the stricken vessel and transport them at high speed to Lae. The remaining 700 were lost at sea. At 0800 on the 3rd of March, under clear skies, the Allied air forces were at last able to deliver the first of their prepared attacks on the convoy. Within an hour, a series of high-level bombing attacks by B-17s had given way to a long series of medium and low-level bombing and strafing attacks. Australian A-20 Bostons from the 22 Squadron, Beaufighters from number 30 Squadron made repeated strafing attacks on the freighters and the destroyers in order to suppress the anti-aircraft fire and to target the officers on the bridge. Anticipating torpedo attacks, the Japanese vessels turned into the attacks, thereby exposing the bridge officers further to the strafing aircraft. With the anti-aircraft fire disrupted, the B-25 Thomas Raider aircraft, fitted with heavy machine guns and cannon armament, were able to make accurate, unimpeded attacks. Similarly, American aircrews were able to utilize the trading opportunity of the past weeks to skip their bombs into the sides of the Japanese ships. The US after-action report noted that the Japanese escort fighters were caught out of position by the sudden shift from a high altitude to the low-level attacks and were too high to intercept the 2nd and 3rd wave of the attacks. These fighter aircraft were subsequently engaged by P-38 long-range fighters. In all, some 20 Japanese fighter aircraft were claimed to have been shot down. By 0900, all but 1 of the freighters were sunk or sinking, as well as 3 of the escort destroyers. Referring to the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet, said, "The percentage of hits of the American Air Force's low-level bombing was excellent. Our fleet mistook it for a torpedo attack and suitable evasive action was not taken." Follow-up attacks succeeded in sinking an additional destroyer, but an attack by RAAF Beauforts of number 100 Squadron was disrupted by bad weather. Later in the day, the remaining freighter, already on fire as a result of their air attacks, was torpedoed by 2 PT boats and was sunk. Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over, almost. While the remaining destroyers were saving some 2,400 survivors, the Allied aircraft returned to their base to be rearmed and refueled. Over the following 2 days, Allied aircrew had the unfortunate duty of attacking any surviving Japanese in their lifeboats and barges, while also preventing any rescue vessels from moving into the area. It was distasteful work, which has since been alluded to as a possible war crime. This is not the case. The survivors were in fact a force in being well within range of Lae. Many were not in lifeboats or even in rafts, but were in the barges and the smaller supply vessels that had been cut the cargo on the freighters. Once ashore, these troops would have represented a serious threat to the Allied soldiers who later attacked the Lae area. The destruction of the Bismarck convoy was to be a devastating blow to the Japanese. General MacArthur analysed the effect as follows: "We have achieved a victory of such completeness as to assume the proportions of a major disaster to the enemy. Our decisive success cannot fail to have the most important results on the enemy's strategic and tactical plans. His campaign, for the time being at least, is completely dislocated." MacArthur was correct. Unable to challenge the Allied control of the air and sea, the Japanese abandoned any further large supply convoys into the region. This only left fast destroyers or small stealthy barges available to bring in what supplies they could while running the gauntlet of air attacks. Captured Japanese documents revealed that the flow of supplies was never to meet the requirements of the ground force, and that the final attempt to resupply the garrison at Lae was abandoned in the face of incessant air attacks. Resupply by submarine was also attempted with some success, but this meant that the offensive capability of the submarine was being abandoned for purely logistics purposes. More importantly, the Bismarck Sea action drove change in Japanese operational objectives. Prior to the battle, the direction of the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters was to maintain an offensive posture with the view of capturing Port Moresby. After the battle, the possibility of regaining the offensive was noted as little more than an aspirational goal and was eventually dropped altogether. It was one of the first indicators that Japan knew it would never regain the initiative in the Pacific, and that there could only be one final outcome to the war. It was indeed a seminal moment in Australia's campaign. There is, however, perhaps some lingering misunderstanding as to the overall influence of the battle. In announcing the victory in Australia, the Prime Minister John Curtin stated on the 17th of March that Japanese forces had lost 3 cruisers, 7 destroyers, 12 transport ships, 63 aircraft, and 15,000 troops, with a total estimated cost of some £10 million. Something of an exaggeration, I'll grant, but one based on MacArthur's initial and inflated estimations. So the suggested magnitude of the victory did mislead the Australian public, and then perhaps immediately imbued the nature of the Bismarck Sea victory with more influence than it may have deserved. There was, however, some enduring influence on the Allied planning for the remaining period of the war in the Pacific. In the months prior to the Bismarck Sea action, MacArthur had been working on plans for the capture of New Britain, and more specifically the harbour at Rabaul, then the largest Japanese garrison in the Pacific in terms of ships, aircraft and troops. MacArthur noted not only was the capture of Rabaul essential in eliminating the major Japanese stronghold in the region, but as detailed in the Elkton Plan of February 43, the Allies would require 21 divisions and 1,800 aircraft to take Rabaul. To place this into perspective, the offensive to drive the Japanese back along the Kokoda Track had only required the commitment of components of 2 divisions and only several hundred aircraft. However, as a result of the Casablanca Conference of January 43, it was clear that the Allied strategy of Europe first resulted in too limited resources being allocated to the Southwest Pacific area to enable a major offensive against Rabaul. Instead, a more limited offensive with forces then allocated was developed. The success of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as well as the increasing effective submarine campaign against Japanese shipping, demonstrated that isolating Japanese garrisons could be a viable option in lieu of direct attacks. This proved to be true, and Rabaul was isolated but never captured, remaining in Japanese hands until the very end of the war. Operations, such as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, did become a routine element in World War II operations. We can see similar examples conducted to varying degrees of success in several theatres. The German air campaign against the British Murmansk convoys to Russia, the RAAF's Desert Air Force operations against Rommel's Mediterranean supply lines, and even wider Allied operations against the Japanese shipping routes, as indicated on this map, all demonstrate that's a similar object and at times similar techniques. There is one example of 1944 which bears a remarkable similarity to the Bismarck Sea operation. A German convoy of 7 freighters and 7 escort ships attempted to relieve the beleaguered garrison isolated on the island of Crete. In a coordinated series of air attacks, in part informed by the RAAF's 454 squadron shadowing the convoy, every ship was sunk by Allied air power. The last ship, already ablaze, was sunk just as it reached the Crete shoreline. However, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is and will remain the seminal battle which marked the turning point in the war fought on our doorstep. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I'm quite happy to take questions.
Once again, any questions from here? Mark up the back, and then is it Phil? Mark.
Martin, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'd like to just ask your view of the Beaufort's role in the attack. Obviously, the crews who were sent intended to do whatever they could to damage or sink, and they were let down again, I understand, by the firstly the weather, but also the lack of reliability of the US Navy torpedoes that they were carrying. But how important was that torpedo attack in setting up the Japanese fleet response to what they thought was a further torpedo attack? In other words, was it calculated strategy, regardless of the success, to have the Beauforts go in first and then later Beaufighters attacking as if they were torpedo bombers?
Look, my understanding of the chronology of the attacks would suggest that the Beaufort torpedo attacks didn't really start to emerge until after the Bostons and the Beaufighters had suppressed the enemy air defences, so that the torpedo attack probably didn't have that much of an influence on the Japanese thoughts that they were facing a torpedo attack, and I think that's further reinforced by the Japanese assessment of the battle, and in that they specifically stated that they were probably more misled by the skip bombing that was coming in, thinking that was they were torpedo bombing aircraft rather than skip bombing, which would mean that the aircraft were coming in and off target much faster than a torpedo aircraft would have been.
Yeah, Martin.
You didn't actually, can I just say one thing? You didn't actually mention what type of aircraft were doing the skip bombing. It would be B-25s. B-25s, correct?
Yeah, predominantly B-25s. Yep.
Martin, I've got a question. David Knight. I read that it was an Australian ruse that the Japanese believed that it was torpedo attack coming, which is why they turned in to face the incoming force, but it wasn't a torpedo attack, it was strafing, and they shot out all the bridge and all the controls of the ships, which had a significant effect, didn't it?
Yeah, look, I don't know if it was so much a ruse as an unintended consequence of their plan to suppress the anti-aircraft fire from the vessels to enable the slower Mitchells to come in with less threat from the anti-aircraft stuff. So while the Japanese commanders were made a poor decision, it wasn't, I don't feel, as a result of a deliberate ruse, but like I say, more as an unintended consequence of the suppression of anti-aircraft fire.
Any questions from our Zoom members, if I may, there?
Yeah, I've got a question, David. Peter Dunn. Well, it's not a
Peter.
question, actually. It's just a comment, actually. I've put on as my background at the moment a copy of the page out of Bull Gehring's logbook. I've got a copy of the full logbook from his son, and I just saw the entry for March, and I don't know whether you can read it, but it says March, and it's a bit crossed out. It's probably the 2nd to the 4th of March. Battle of the Bismarck Sea underlined. All Jap convoy of 20 to 22 ships destroyed. And then he's got at the end, battle, I think it's Puget, P-O-U-G-E-T, on 3rd of March, 1943.
Yeah.
Bull Gehring was a very interesting guy. If you look at his logbook, he flew so many different types of aircraft. He probably one of the most flown RAAF pilot, I'd say, of many different types of aircraft. Anyway, that's all. I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, but the comment's interesting because and you can see why people were misled about the magnitude of the victory. I've got access to the RAAF Southwest Pacific Area Intelligence summaries for that period. And it almost provides a running commentary of the intel as it's rolling in from the reconnaissance aircraft, from the signals intercepts, these sorts of things.
Yep.
And it's quite clear that they're making assumptions and assessments around fragmented reports, which they believe are relating to portions of a convoy rather than reports all about the same convoy. So subtle differences in positions that are being given by multiple aircraft, timings of the reports made them think that the convoy was much larger and much spaced out than what it actually was. So I think there's that initial feeling was that they decimated a convoy because there was nothing left floating, and so they assumed that they had sunk more than what they really had. It wasn't until they started gathering intelligence from the further signals intercepts and then later captured documents that really gave them a proper sense of what they'd achieved.
Yep. So always a lot of exaggeration in some of the first-hand reports.
Absolutely. So it's not just fighter pilots that inflate their kills.
Yes.
Okay, Peter Hobbins has the next question. Peter, you'll need to unmute. Great.
Hi, Peter.
G'day, Martin. Nice to see you again. Look, thanks. I really appreciated you putting that into the bigger strategic context as well. I think that helped enormously understand the impact of the operation. My question goes back a year to the Battle of Midway, and I was thinking as you were describing the planned multi-layered attack on the fleet, that was sort of more by accident than by design what the US Navy aviators did at Midway. And I just wondered whether any of those US Navy reports had fed into how the operation was planned in March 43.
Good question, and I wish I could give you a good answer, but unfortunately I've not seen anything to suggest one way or the other. Certainly, though, that looking at the weekly intelligence summaries that were becoming a routine circulated document, right down to pilot level at the line squadrons, would suggest that this sort of information was coming out regularly. And so I can't see anything that specifically points to it influencing the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, but I'd be very surprised if there wasn't certain things coming out that was shaping the planning.
Thanks, Martin. And then a question from Dion, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Martin. Very interesting presentation, an interesting subject matter. My question was simply looking at the quality of the photos emanating from the attack and what they were subsequently able to view, I guess. I don't know if you can answer this, but do you think the intelligence people were able to gain a lot of good information, such as the state of the Japanese destroyers, how they were perhaps being modified or upgraded or anything like that? Anything of value as well, just as a secondary outcome from the attacks?
Well, I think a couple of things. The quality of the imagery that was being captured, I think there's two good reasons for it. One is that the bow fighters in particular had a pretty effective camera, two different camera systems that they could use. But there was also at least one photographer from the Australian Public Affairs Unit on one of the bow fighters, and with both motion and still cameras available. Wow. And in fact, one of the images I was almost going to use and didn't use in tonight's presentation was a picture of the back of the head of the pilot of a bow fighter taken by the APU photographer at the time. But the Allies were taking every possible opportunity to gather and disseminate intelligence on every single aspect of Japanese operations. There's a series of binders held at the National Archives of Australia, and it's the weekly intelligence summaries produced by the RAAF headquarters, India. And whilst the first few pages always relate to the India-Burma theatre, there's a complete summary from across the global air campaign of the Second World War in those binders. They kick off at about early 1943 and run through to the end of the war, including the then classified summary of the Dam Busters raid by Guy Gibson, which sounds exciting when you hear about it, but he doesn't say anything we don't know or we don't already know now anyway. However, when you read through those books with those binders and those weekly intelligence summaries and the information they're trying to feed out to aircrew and to ops planners, etc., they are looking to find, disseminate, and analyze every piece of intelligence they can. I'll just give you one example because it's pertinent to some of the things that we mentioned. That they'd sense the effectiveness of the anti-aircraft gunners on both Japanese vessels and ashore, and the analysis indicated that the anti-aircraft gunners on Navy vessels were far superior to those in the Japanese Army, and that the techniques being employed by the Japanese Army was that when they were attacked from the air, they would analyze the nature of the direction of the attack, the speed, the angle of attack, anything that is relevant, and then they would set up all their guns and fusing of their shells around the nature of the last attack that they'd received. Now, one would assume then you only had to change your attack pattern, and you defeat or at least delay the response from the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners. Well, as we know, Bill Newton, when he was shot down, he was repeating within 24 hours an identical attack on a Japanese supply station. And so the guns were already set up aiming exactly where he'd come from the day before in the same angle of attack that he approached the target the second time around, and got shot down as a result. Now, that information about the way the Japanese were analysing their anti-aircraft fire wasn't disseminated until 1944. Too late to say, Bill. But it just goes to show that they were trying to always keep people informed as much as possible about the I suppose the TTPs of the Japanese forces.
Miller, I'm sorry. In reference to the comments being made about Bill not being able to be given that information about how the Japanese worked on things, it's normal military practice, surely, not to repeat the same exercise twice. It was like when if an aircraft made an attack and the bombs didn't go down because for one reason or another, you don't keep making a pass. You just bugger off and put it down for another day, because pretty much everybody who came back around, tried again, got shot down anyway. So I sort of question a little bit about whoever planned Bill Newton's attack. It should not have been planned that way. End of story.
Look, I would tend to agree. Good planning would suggest you change your approach, but unfortunately, as we know, that wasn't the case this time around, and Bill and the crew suffered as a result. Unfortunate, but it's one of those things that happened.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks. Boston's my pet subject. I've been studying for 20 years, and Bill Newton's operations are a particular interest. The reason Bill was shot down on his second mission is he had an incorrect bomb load installed. Instead of delayed action bombs, he had instantaneous fuse bombs, which means he had to come in a glide attack into Salamaua instead of a low-level attack. Because of that, he came in behind other crews, and he's literally screaming to them over the radio to get out of the way because he was coming down. And yeah, he was bracketed by Japanese 75mm guns as he went through a ridge line. It went back to, they changed the mission. He was supposed to be attacking somewhere else, and then the mission was changed to Salamaua, and he had the wrong fuses installed in his bombs for the type of mission he was doing. And
Henry, did you have a question there?
Yes, we had heard also that patrolling Catalina had seen the Japs the day before and deliberately sent a message in plain instead of in code about we'll be seeing a torpedo aircraft happen tomorrow. So the Japs were expecting torpedo aircraft, and they were not bow forced with torpedoes, but bow fighters with their heavy cannon and machine gun fire. You did mention that they concentrate on shooting at the bridge, the bridge of each ship, where massive damage can be done with just the cannon or something. Then they sent the Beauforts with the torpedoes as the next wave. And of course, the ships are a lot of them were by then disabled and slowed down and not so easy to be fighting when the bridge had been under such heavy attack.
one more thing on Boston's, if I can. The initial attack, 22 Squadron wasn't involved in that. They actually did another raid on Lade to try and keep the fighters on the ground. They weren't involved until later missions on the 3rd and then the 4th. The first aircraft in there were the Beaufighters, the 30 Squadron, and A-20s of the 89th Bomb Squadron 3rd Attack Group. The A-20s from the 89th, actually the most successful aircraft in the Battle of Bismarck Sea raid. They had an 80% success rate. The 22 500-pound bombs they dropped, they had 80% hit their targets on their first attacks. Because they were coming in with the Beaufighters, which took them out of, took the attention of the anti-aircraft gunners. The following waves that then started to get mixed in were the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Attack Group, who also had strafing B-25s, and the 13th Bomb Squadron. Their aircraft hadn't been configured for strafers. They came in, they both had lower success rates. The 90th Bomb Squadron was around 65% successful, and the 13th was around 40% successful. Other aircraft involved in the missions, 38th Bomb Group with B-25s at medium level, and the high levels were much lower. They were down around 8 to 15% success rates of their bombs. When 22 Squadron actually came in the late afternoon, the next day, they were at about 12% because they were doing glide bombing. They weren't actually doing low level because the different bombs, the American bomb was actually a better bomb than the British bombs we were using. And the standard bomb load in the Boston was two 250-pound semi-armor piercing and two 500-pound general purpose bombs. And the way they attacked, they actually sunk that last destroyer, was accredited to 22 Squadron. But the attack procedures of 22 weren't as advanced as the 89th Bomb Squadron at that stage in anti-shipping.
David, I just another comment, if I could. Martin, there's another reference here on losses. You know, there's all different versions. This is from the command summary of Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, dated the 3rd of March. Now, that's a Hawaiian date, so it's roughly the 4th of March, our time. It says, secret dispatches describe repeated Southwest Pacific airstrikes starting the 2nd, and it's got in brackets minus 10 hours, on a Jap convoy approaching the northeast coast of New Guinea. The information is not clear-cut, but it seems probable that 14 AK, so capital A, capital K, I can't remember the codes. It's a type of Japanese ship, obviously. 14 AK, 4 AP, and 4 DD were hit. And of these, a number were sunk. Our air losses were remarkably small, namely 3 VB and 1 VF. Just thought I'd share that.
We have a decoder.
Oh, do you? Oh, well, there you go.
Now, I think the first reference was to an AK.
Yeah, 14 AK.
Which is US Navy talk for a freight transport ship.
Right.
The second reference was to an AP.
Correct.
United States Navy reference to a troop carrying ship.
So there were 4 of them, and then 4 DDs, which is probably a destroyer, isn't it?
Which is destroyers.
Yeah.
And the VB and the VF is as follows. Yes, Navy bomber, Navy fighter.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, if we've got no further questions there, I think we might close off. And Martin, thank you very much for a most interesting talk.
It's a pleasure.
One last one up the very back there. It looks like someone called Mark Pilkington has his hand raised in the air. Mark.
And I'm not sure that everyone was aware that an 11 Squadron Catalina shadowed the convoys that came down the western coast of New Britain before it turned into what became the Bismarck Sea bloodbath. But that RAAF 11 Squadron Catalina A2414 was captained by Terence Dygan, son of Reg Dygan and nephew of John Dygan. So an important name involved in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea.
There you go.
Once again, Martin, thank you very much for your talk tonight. Well researched and adding a lot of knowledge on the Battle of the Bismarck Sea to us tonight. So from our point of view, thank you, sir. Do appreciate, and all from both our Zoom people and of course our spectators here as well tonight. Thank you.
Pleasure.